What if your body has been sending you clear, specific signals about muscle loss for months, or even years, and you've been quietly dismissing every single one of them as simply getting older? Most people over 50 assume muscle loss is something that only becomes obvious once you can visibly see it in the mirror, a noticeable shrinking of the arms or thighs that finally makes the issue impossible to ignore. But by the time muscle loss becomes visually obvious, a significant amount of muscle tissue has often already been lost, sometimes gradually over several years without ever being clearly recognized for what it actually was. There are 5 specific, earlier signs that tend to show up well before visible muscle loss, subtle changes in daily function and physical capability that most people notice individually without ever connecting them to a single underlying cause. So today we're going to walk through these 5 specific signs, exactly why each one reflects muscle loss happening beneath the surface, and precisely what you can do starting today to slow, stop, or even reverse this process. Before we begin, remember this video is for education only. If you're experiencing sudden, significant, or unexplained weakness, please speak with your doctor, since this can sometimes indicate an underlying condition requiring direct evaluation beyond general age-related muscle loss. Now let's begin. Most people ask, how do I know if I'm losing muscle? But most people are looking for the answer in the wrong place, checking the mirror or stepping on a scale, when the earliest, most reliable signs actually show up in how your body performs everyday tasks, well before any visible change becomes apparent. The better question is, what specific functional changes tend to happen first before muscle loss becomes something you can see, and have I noticed any of these changes in my own daily life without connecting them to muscle mass specifically? Because age-related muscle loss, a process with the clinical name sarcopenia, tends to progress gradually and functionally before it progresses visibly, meaning the earliest opportunity to notice and address it comes from paying attention to what your body can and can't do, rather than waiting for a change in appearance. Here is why this process becomes so relevant and worth understanding specifically after 50. Muscle mass naturally begins declining gradually starting around this decade for most people, with research suggesting adults can lose somewhere between 3 and 8% of their total muscle mass per decade starting after 50, a rate that tends to accelerate further after 60, particularly for anyone who isn't specifically engaging in resistance exercise to counteract this natural decline. This loss isn't uniform or purely cosmetic. It directly affects strength, balance, metabolic rate, and even bone density, since muscle and bone health are closely interconnected. Understanding the early, functional warning signs, rather than waiting for visible changes, gives you a meaningful window of opportunity to intervene while the process is still relatively early and considerably more responsive to correction through targeted exercise and adequate protein intake. Think of muscle loss like a slow leak in a tire rather than a sudden flat. A sudden flat tire is impossible to miss, obvious, and immediate. But a slow, gradual leak produces subtle changes first, the car pulling slightly to one side, a bit more road noise, slightly reduced fuel efficiency, changes that are easy to attribute to something else entirely, road conditions, weather, simply not paying close attention until eventually the tire becomes visibly and undeniably low. Muscle loss after 50 tends to follow this same gradual, easy-to-miss pattern, producing subtle functional changes well before anything becomes visually obvious, changes that are easy to attribute to general aging, being tired, or simply having an off day, rather than recognizing them as a specific, early signal of muscle mass actually declining. Let's start with the first sign, and one that many people notice without ever connecting it to muscle loss specifically: difficulty rising from a low chair or the floor without using your hands or arms for assistance. This particular movement, standing up from a seated position without pushing off with your hands, requires a genuinely significant amount of strength specifically from your quadriceps and glutes, the large muscle groups in your thighs and hips. As these muscle groups gradually lose mass and strength, many people unconsciously begin relying more and more on their arms to push off and assist with this movement, a compensation that happens so gradually that most people never consciously notice they've started doing it, simply accepting it as their new normal way of standing up. If you notice that you now regularly use your hands or arms to push off from a chair, or that getting up from sitting on the floor has become something you actively think about and prepare for, rather than a movement you perform without any conscious effort, this represents a genuine, measurable indication of declining lower body muscle strength, one that research on functional aging assessments specifically uses as a meaningful marker of muscle health, precisely because it reflects such a fundamental, everyday movement pattern. The second sign involves a noticeably weaker grip strength, something many people notice in small, everyday moments: difficulty opening a jar lid that used to feel easy, struggling somewhat to twist open a stubborn bottle cap, or noticing that carrying grocery bags feels more taxing on your hands and forearms than it once did. Grip strength has become an increasingly recognized marker in research specifically because it correlates remarkably well with overall body muscle mass and strength, meaning weakening grip strength often reflects a broader pattern of muscle loss happening throughout your body, not simply an isolated issue with your hands and forearms specifically. This connection exists because grip strength depends on a genuinely large, complex network of muscles extending from your hand all the way up through your forearm, and this muscle group tends to decline in parallel with your body's broader overall muscle mass, making it a surprisingly useful, easily noticeable early indicator. If you've noticed several small moments like these accumulating, jars feeling harder to open, a handshake that feels less firm than it once did, or simply a general sense that your hands tire more quickly during tasks requiring sustained grip, this pattern is worth taking seriously as a potential early sign of broader muscle loss. The third sign involves noticeably slower walking speed, particularly when trying to walk briskly or when crossing a street before a light changes, finding that a pace which once felt comfortable and easily sustainable now requires more conscious effort, or that you're consistently walking somewhat slower than people around you without necessarily choosing to. Walking speed depends heavily on lower body muscle strength and power, particularly in your calves, thighs, and hips, and as this muscle strength gradually declines, your natural, comfortable walking pace tends to slow correspondingly, often without any conscious decision to walk more slowly. This is precisely why walking speed itself has become a genuinely well-researched, meaningful marker of overall health and muscle function in older adults, with some research finding that walking speed alone can predict various health outcomes with a notable degree of reliability, precisely because it reflects such a fundamental, whole-body indicator of muscle strength and function working together. If you've noticed that walking briskly now requires noticeably more conscious effort than it once did, or that your natural, comfortable pace has gradually slowed over recent years, this represents a meaningful, measurable sign worth paying attention to. The fourth sign involves noticeable fatigue after carrying items that didn't previously feel particularly heavy or demanding, such as grocery bags, laundry baskets, or a briefcase or bag you carry regularly, finding that these familiar, routine tasks now leave your arms or shoulders feeling more fatigued than they once did, or that you find yourself needing to set items down and rest partway through a task you used to complete without any noticeable strain. This particular sign reflects declining upper body muscle mass and strength specifically, and because upper body strength often receives less attention and less deliberate exercise focus compared to lower body strength or general cardiovascular fitness, many people notice this particular decline somewhat later than lower body changes, simply because they're engaging in fewer regular activities that would reveal upper body weakness early. If routine carrying tasks that once felt entirely unremarkable now produce noticeable fatigue or require you to pause and rest, this is worth recognizing as a genuine sign of muscle loss, specifically in your upper body, rather than simply attributing it to having a busier or more tiring day than usual. Now let's talk about the fifth and final sign, and this one is somewhat less intuitive than the others but is genuinely well supported by research on muscle health: a noticeable increase in how easily you feel cold, particularly in your hands, feet, or overall body temperature regulation, compared to how you felt in earlier years. Muscle tissue is metabolically active, meaning it generates a meaningful amount of heat as part of its normal, ongoing function, even at rest, contributing to your body's overall ability to maintain a comfortable core temperature. As muscle mass declines, your body has correspondingly less of this naturally heat-generating tissue, which can contribute to feeling colder more easily than you once did, particularly in cooler environments or during colder months, a connection distinct from some of the circulatory causes of cold hands and feet discussed in other conversations, though these different mechanisms can certainly overlap and compound each other in some individuals. If you've noticed needing more layers than you once did, or feeling uncomfortably cold in environments that never used to bother you, particularly alongside any of the other four signs already discussed, this combination is worth considering together as part of a broader pattern potentially reflecting declining muscle mass. Now, before we go further, let's debunk a few common myths about muscle loss after 50 specifically. For years, many people believed that muscle loss is purely a visible, cosmetic issue, something you'd notice by looking in the mirror rather than through changes in daily function and physical capability. Some believed that muscle loss is entirely inevitable and essentially unstoppable once it begins, regardless of what actions you take in response. Some believed that muscle loss only matters for appearance or athletic performance, without significant relevance to everyday health, balance, or independence. And some believed that these 5 signs discussed today are simply normal, unavoidable parts of getting older that don't warrant any particular concern or action. But when we look at the actual research on sarcopenia and its functional, everyday manifestations, the picture becomes considerably more actionable and considerably less fatalistic. The real questions are not simply, do I look visibly weaker or smaller, or have I always assumed these changes are just part of aging? The better questions are, do I now use my hands to push off when standing up from low seating? Has my grip strength noticeably weakened in everyday tasks? Has my natural walking pace slowed? Do routine carrying tasks now produce more fatigue than they once did? And do I feel cold more easily than I used to? Recognizing these 5 functional signs early, rather than waiting for visible muscle loss to become apparent, provides a genuine, meaningful window of opportunity to intervene while your body remains considerably more responsive to the specific corrective actions discussed next. Now let's talk about what actually works to slow, stop, or even reverse this process, starting with the single most well-established, evidence-supported intervention, resistance or strength training specifically. Unlike general cardiovascular exercise, which offers genuine, important health benefits but doesn't specifically target muscle mass preservation and growth in the same direct way, resistance training, meaning exercise that involves your muscles working against some form of resistance, whether bodyweight, resistance bands, or weights, provides a direct, specific stimulus that signals your body to maintain and build muscle tissue. Research consistently shows that adults over 50, even those who haven't engaged in resistance training previously, can meaningfully build back muscle mass and strength through a consistent resistance training program, generally recommended at a frequency of 2 to 3 sessions per week, targeting the major muscle groups throughout your body rather than focusing narrowly on just 1 or 2 areas. This doesn't require an elaborate gym membership or complex equipment to begin, since bodyweight exercises like chair squats, wall push-ups, and simple resistance band exercises can provide a genuinely meaningful stimulus, particularly for anyone just beginning this practice after years without any structured strength training. The second essential intervention involves adequate protein intake, since your muscles require sufficient protein as the actual building material needed to maintain and repair muscle tissue, and protein needs actually tend to increase somewhat after 50, rather than decreasing as calorie needs sometimes do, due to a phenomenon researchers call anabolic resistance, where older muscle tissue becomes somewhat less efficient at using available protein for muscle maintenance and growth, meaning a higher intake is often needed to achieve the same muscle-preserving effect that a smaller amount might have provided in earlier decades. Many nutrition guidelines specifically recommend adults over 50 aim for somewhere between 1 and 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily, though individual needs can vary, and spreading this protein intake across multiple meals throughout the day, rather than concentrating most of it in a single meal, tends to support more effective muscle protein synthesis than the same total amount consumed all at once. The third essential intervention involves adequate vitamin D and, where relevant, addressing any underlying deficiency, since vitamin D plays a meaningful role in muscle function and strength, beyond its more commonly discussed role in bone health specifically. Vitamin D deficiency, which becomes increasingly common after 50 due to less efficient synthesis through skin exposure to sunlight, has been specifically associated with reduced muscle strength and increased fall risk in multiple studies, meaning addressing an underlying deficiency, when present, through appropriate sun exposure, dietary sources, or supplementation as recommended by your doctor, represents a genuinely relevant, evidence-supported piece of a comprehensive approach to preserving muscle strength and function. Now let's talk about the fourth intervention, and this one involves consistency and progressive overload specifically, meaning gradually increasing the demand placed on your muscles over time as they adapt and become stronger, rather than performing the exact same exercise routine indefinitely without any progression. Muscles adapt specifically to the demands placed on them, meaning a resistance training routine that felt appropriately challenging 6 months ago may no longer provide sufficient stimulus for continued muscle maintenance and growth once your body has adapted to that particular level of demand. This doesn't necessarily mean dramatically increasing weight or resistance every single week, but rather periodically reassessing your routine, perhaps every 4 to 6 weeks, and making modest, gradual increases, whether in resistance, repetitions, or exercise complexity, ensuring your muscles continue receiving a genuinely meaningful stimulus rather than plateauing at a level that no longer provides sufficient challenge for continued benefit. Now let's talk about the fifth and final intervention, adequate sleep and stress management, factors that connect to muscle health in ways many people don't initially consider relevant. Muscle repair and growth happen significantly during sleep, when your body releases growth hormone and undertakes much of its tissue repair processes, meaning consistently inadequate or poor quality sleep can meaningfully undermine the muscle-building benefits of even a well-structured resistance training and nutrition routine. Similarly, chronic, elevated stress and the associated persistently elevated cortisol levels can promote muscle breakdown over time, working directly against the muscle-preserving efforts discussed throughout this video, making stress management, including practices like the paced breathing techniques discussed in other conversations, a genuinely relevant, if less obvious, piece of a comprehensive approach to preserving muscle mass after 50. Let's talk a bit more about how to actually begin a resistance training routine if you're starting essentially from scratch, since this can feel intimidating for anyone who hasn't engaged in structured strength training previously. Starting with simple bodyweight exercises, chair squats, wall push-ups, and standing leg raises using a wall or sturdy chair for balance support, performed for 2 to 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions, 2 to 3 times per week, provides a genuinely reasonable, accessible starting point that doesn't require any equipment or gym membership. As these movements begin feeling more manageable over several weeks, gradually progressing to resistance bands, which are inexpensive and provide a wide range of resistance levels, or eventually light hand weights if you choose to progress further, allows for continued, appropriate progression without requiring an intimidating jump directly into more advanced equipment or unfamiliar gym environments. It's also worth mentioning the value of working with a physical therapist or a qualified trainer experienced with older adults, particularly if you're managing any existing joint concerns, have never engaged in structured exercise previously, or simply feel uncertain about proper form and technique when beginning a new resistance training routine. Proper form matters considerably for both safety and effectiveness, and a few sessions with a qualified professional to establish correct technique can provide a genuinely valuable foundation, even if you plan to continue your routine independently afterward. Let's talk a bit more about a simple, at-home way to get a slightly more objective sense of where you currently stand, beyond simply reflecting on these 5 signs conversationally. A commonly used, informal assessment involves timing how long it takes you to rise from a standard chair, walk a short distance of about 10 feet, turn around, walk back, and sit back down without rushing but at a natural, comfortable pace. While this isn't a substitute for professional assessment, taking somewhat longer than roughly 12 seconds to complete this sequence is sometimes used as a general marker worth discussing further with your doctor, and more usefully, repeating this same simple time test every few weeks or months as you begin incorporating resistance training gives you a concrete, personal way to track genuine, measurable progress over time, rather than relying purely on subjective impressions of feeling stronger. It's also worth mentioning grip strength specifically, since this can be measured more precisely with an inexpensive hand dynamometer, a small device that measures grip force directly, available for a relatively modest cost and simple enough to use at home without any professional guidance required. Testing your grip strength on each hand initially, then retesting periodically as you incorporate resistance training and adequate protein into your routine, provides another concrete, trackable measure that can help confirm genuine progress, particularly valuable during the earlier weeks and months of a new routine, when visible or dramatic changes may not yet be apparent but underlying strength improvements are often already genuinely occurring. Let's also briefly discuss how quickly you might reasonably expect to notice improvement once you begin addressing these signs through resistance training and adequate protein intake. Research on resistance training in older adults generally shows measurable strength improvements beginning within 4 to 6 weeks of consistent training, often before any visible change in muscle size becomes apparent, meaning some of the 5 functional signs discussed today, particularly grip strength and ease of rising from a seated position, may show genuine improvement relatively early in your routine, providing encouraging, tangible feedback well before more visible changes develop over the following months of continued, consistent effort, and are wondering whether it's genuinely possible to meaningfully rebuild strength and muscle mass at this point, rather than simply slowing further decline. Research consistently shows that adults well into their 60s, 70s, and even 80s can meaningfully rebuild muscle mass and strength through consistent resistance training, even after years of significant decline, meaning it's genuinely never too late to begin this process and see meaningful, measurable improvement, though the rate and extent of improvement can vary based on individual factors, making this a conversation worth having directly with your doctor if you're managing significant existing muscle loss or related health concerns. And what about people who recognize several of these 5 signs in their own daily life but are managing joint pain, arthritis, or other conditions that make traditional resistance training feel genuinely difficult or uncomfortable? Working with a physical therapist to develop a modified, joint-friendly resistance training approach, potentially including water-based resistance exercises, which reduce joint impact considerably while still providing genuine resistance for muscle maintenance, represents a reasonable, effective alternative for anyone managing joint concerns that make traditional land-based resistance training feel prohibitively uncomfortable. Now let's summarize everything in a simple way. 5 specific signs that may indicate declining muscle mass after 50, often appearing well before any visible change becomes apparent, include needing to use your hands to push off when rising from low seating, noticeably weaker grip strength during everyday tasks, a slowed natural walking pace, increased fatigue when carrying routine items like groceries, and feeling cold more easily than you once did. Recognizing these 5 functional signs early provides a genuine window of opportunity to intervene through the 5 key interventions discussed today: consistent resistance training targeting your major muscle groups, adequate protein intake spread throughout the day, addressing any underlying vitamin D deficiency, progressively increasing the demand placed on your muscles over time, and supporting adequate sleep and stress management, all working together to slow, stop, or even meaningfully reverse age-related muscle loss. But remember, muscle loss after 50, while a genuine and common part of the aging process, is not simply an inevitable, unstoppable decline you must passively accept. It's a genuinely modifiable process, particularly when addressed early, through specific, evidence-supported actions available to nearly everyone, regardless of your current fitness level or how long it's been since you last engaged in structured exercise. So today, take a moment to honestly consider whether you've noticed any of these 5 signs in your own daily life. If you have, consider this a genuine, valuable signal, not a cause for alarm, but a clear, actionable prompt to begin incorporating simple resistance exercises into your weekly routine, paying closer attention to your protein intake throughout the day, and discussing your vitamin D levels with your doctor at your next appointment. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these 5 signs did you recognize in your own daily life? And have you already made any changes to your exercise or nutrition routine in response? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may help someone else watching this video recognize a pattern in their own body they hadn't connected to muscle loss before. If this video helped you, please like, subscribe to Nutri, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more simple, practical health strategies for adults over 50. And next, watch our video on eating fruit at night after 50, and what actually happens to your blood sugar, because understanding your body's changing needs, whether in your muscles or your metabolism, gives you genuine practical tools to support your strength, energy, and independence for many years to come.